Hello, it's Media Center Ukraine, Odessa. We are continuing our briefing day, and our last briefing for today is about Georgian protests, which are connected to the law about so-called foreign agents. The law was a cause for mass protests in Georgia. We're going to speak about that with Bakur Kvashilava, Professor of International Relations and Politics of the Georgian Institute of Public Affairs, and Sergi Kapanadze, former Vice Speaker of the Parliament of Georgia. They are here with us online. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. So let's start with the questions of how do you think, what were the causes of this law, of appearing of this law, and why this law was a cause for such mass protests in Georgia? Let's answer one by one. Let's start with Bakur. So please, Bakur.
I believe that the protests had a long history. As it said in one of the famous documents, it was a long train of abuses of the government that led to the protests, especially in regard to our foreign policy direction, which is our Euro-Atlantic integration. And this law has been perceived by the public, I would say by the vast majority of the population, as derailing this effort. I would like to remind your audience that similar protests broke out about in the summer or about a year ago, when there was a question of granting candidacy to Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova, and because of the steps taken by the government, that time Georgia was denied the candidacy, and the government was blamed for it, and I believe rightly so. And now, when the chances of granting candidacy came real, government again took the steps that was at odds with our European aspirations, and it was neglecting all the criticisms and the recommendations coming from our partners, insisting that it doesn't deny us the European track, and we will be still, integrating with the EU, and the public correctly decided that it wasn't true. So they decided to express themselves, and we all went to the streets. And now we see the consequences of it. Government retracted the law, rescinded the law, and is now, in a difficult position. And I hope that they will not dare in the future to endanger our European aspirations.
Thank you, Sergi. Is the same questions. How do you think? What were the causes for this law, and what are the consequences?
Yeah, I fully agree with Bakur. First of all, hello to the audience who's tuned in. I fully agree with Bakur in his assessment. I will maybe just add that as for the reasons, one of the major reasons was the increased authoritarianism in Georgia during the last years, and the attempt by the government, which is led by an oligarch, Mr. Ivanishvili, to maximize power as much as possible. And in that quest towards maximization of power, he has, first of all, targeted the political opposition, and now he has gone after the civil society and media. Because effectively, civil society and media are the two kind of independent islands who are not controlled by the government. And the attacks against the media have also several years of track record, but now civil society came up at the front. And civil society has been demonized recently, particularly by verbal attacks, by making them making them pariahs, basically trying to make them as pariahs by linking them with the politics and opposition. And now they try to go after the finances, so to say, and also try to discredit them by calling them foreign agents. But by the end of the day, the major outcome of this crisis is that not just the civil society and media, but mainly the youngsters, the new generation, who are not susceptible to the propaganda, to the media propaganda, which government has now through its media channels as well in social media. These people came out and they said, we know that this is the Russian law and it is against Georgia's European path. And so they protested, and government realized that it is impossible to fight these people, because these kids, basically, who are of the age of my son, they are uncontrollable. They made up their mind that they don't want to live in the country with the Russian laws, and they went against it. And so they had to go back. And I agree with Bakur that today the government has officially killed the Russian law. They voted it down, which was a remarkable turn. The same people voted for it, and in 2 days they vote against it. But I don't believe that they're going to stop here. They probably are not going to reintroduce the same law, but the motivation is still there. The motivation to go after civil society, to go after media. And so they're probably going to use other instruments to achieve their goals. And as I said, the goal is the maximization of power and then ultimately staying in power.
Thank you. Bakur, the question for you. Your colleague called this law a Russian law, which is a widespread point of view about this law. And I would like to ask you, what's your opinion about the Russian role in this law? Not only the framework, which was used, as experts say, that it's like a Russian one, but what was the role of Russia, if there were some, in writing this law and trying to vote this law in Georgian parliament? Bakur, how do you think?
Well, we can only stipulate or have, some guesses about the Russian involvement in the law. We don't have any evidence of it, obviously. But at least the law was inspired by Russia. There can be no doubt about it. The 2012 law, which the Russians sold to their public as the, some kind of variation of the American law, the same was done by the Georgian Dream here. They were saying that it's even more lenient than the one that the Americans enacted in 1938 to counteract the fascism. So the context is the same. The essence and the spirit of the law, why it was created, is the same. And I, again, fully agree with Sergi when he is added to the comment that it is the laws that was made not only to forbid Georgia's getting the candidacy of EU, but also to make sure that in the 2024 elections, the government has no potential counterweight. Because if it controls all the sources of finances and also has the ability to call everyone who expresses critical opinion foreign agents, it gains an upper hand. And I believe this is why we called it Russian law, not because it was only Russia that has such law, but because Russians were using it in such a way as Georgian Dream wanted to use it against opposition, civil society, and the society in general.
Thanks. We got a question from one of my colleagues. Please name yourself and ask the question.
Good afternoon. My name is Irina Nazarchuk. If we've started the Russian issue, the discussion of this issue, what are the main messages, the key messages of Russian propaganda around these protests that you can focus on now? So what messages do Russian propaganda use with regard to the protests?
Maybe Sergi will answer that? Or?
I can answer that. We also here at GRAS also study that. The main propaganda messages is that the Georgian government is preventing the West to drag Georgia into the war with Russia. And that now the main protagonists of the war are the Western stooges, who are the political opposition, NGOs, mass media. It's like a big global conspiracy against Russia, Russian world, Russian supporters here, as well as the government of Georgia, that they are all on the same side, basically. And the West goes against them, and that these protests were controlled, they were staged by the West, by Soros, I was just watching one of the propaganda channel, propaganda TV shows this morning from yesterday, and that's the main line, that this is all staged by the United States, and that we are here to be used as a fodder meat, basically, for the U.S. imperialistic purposes in this region, which, excuse my language, is a complete bull, because here, these people who are out in the streets, they're not just simply anybody's fodder meat or anybody's puppets or stooges. These were actual free, independent, European-minded youngsters who occupied the central squares in town, who were probably over 80% of the people who were there. And so, but the Russian propaganda is the same. It has different maybe flavors in Ukraine, in Georgia, but it is the same. That is the global Western conspiracy against Moscow, and everybody is against them, and they're trying to win wherever they can and defend their interests. And the part of propaganda also is that Georgia is now, the friend of Russia, and West is trying to stir up the situation here so that we can become the second front. But to add to this question and to the answer, the bigger problem in this is that the Georgian government, with its rhetoric, fully contributes to the Russian propaganda. Because in the last few months, Georgian government's rhetoric has been that, indeed, there is a danger of a second front being opened from Georgia, and that the West is pushing the Georgian government and is using the local pro-Western forces here to start the war, and they're doing it, to upset Russia, basically. And this is really, really disheartening. And I think one of the reasons why also people came out in the streets was that they are, in a way, sick and tired of this completely untruthful propaganda, which is actually against the national interests of the country.
Thank you. I got a question for both of you, whoever can answer that. During last half a year, possibly, quite big quantities of Russian citizens who were afraid of mobilization in their country fled to Georgia. Did it change somehow the public opinion in Georgia and in the public opinion of politicians, of the mood of the government about Russian-Ukrainian war? I don't know the specific quantities of Russian male citizens who fled to Georgia, but I suppose there were quite many of them. Did it change somehow the Georgian society about our war?
Not at all, I would say, but Sergi can add. I think in most of the population just created some fear that they could act as the fifth column in the future. It also created suspicion and more hostility towards the Russians, and even the Russians who fled the regime even before the war because of Putin's dictatorial regime. I don't think the Russians that came here got any, friendly reception. They are tolerated, but that's about it. It doesn't mean that there is also probably about 10% of the population that likes Russians because of the Soviet Union past, and they, associate them with it. But overwhelming majority, it is conceived as danger, as unwanted thing, and it is expressed in the street art every day. There was one funny moment there, that when the students and the youth and all the people there protested against the MPs, I think it was the day before yesterday, and they were shaming them. They were calling them Russians. They were saying that Russians, and it was a derogatory word. Of course, it doesn't have to do with the whole nation, but it has to do with the regime, and it has to do what Russia represents now in the global world. Evil empires that has to be defeated.
Well, for Georgia, Russia was a clear enemy even earlier than for Ukraine in the 21st century. Sergei, I wanted to ask you, as far as I know, we are going to finish our meeting like in 10 minutes, maybe possibly 15, but I want to hear your point of view about the next efforts, actually. If you're right and this law is only a method of government to strengthen its capabilities and to be more authoritarian than it is now, what will be the next step? If that's not a law, what will be the next one?
It's a good question. There are some of the things which have already been announced. For instance, one idea that has been floating around, and the same group of people who initiated this law have already pre-announced in a way just a few weeks ago, and even spoke about it extensively just a few days ago at one of the propaganda channels, will target the media. And this is the so-called, the law which will target the media, the law which will focus on the defamation in media and spreading the fake news. And even though it might sound legitimate in some of the Western countries and societies, in our case, this means that effectively it will be used as a tool to shut the media up. You see behind my screen the fact-check organization does fact-checking work, so we check the factual accuracy of the statements of the politicians. And any sort of media regulation which would hit the media and make it more self-aware or introduce self-censorship or even censorship is going to kill the projects like this. And so I think that's another way. But beyond that, they already have the instruments which are there. Every single media in Georgia right now is under the court cases, under investigations. One of the leading opposition media channels is now at the verge of being closed. The court case is ongoing. It can be stripped of its owner. The other one is facing bankruptcy. So they already have set this in motion. So when they're gonna give it a final push remains unclear. The manager of one of the critical TV stations is in prison since last year on a completely absurd charge. So the charge is that he was misusing company's car for the family purposes. And there has not been a single person charged and arrested with this article in the criminal code in Georgia ever, except for this guy, because he's a media manager. So there are different instruments that they can use. And the judiciary in our case is not independent, and that's one of the conditions by the European Union, by the way, for getting the candidate status. So they have the instruments. Now, when are they going to push them? When are they going to activate it? It will depend on a decision of Mr. Ivanishvili. The problem with this governance structure and system that we have is that it is vertical and very much centralized in the hand of one man who makes all the major political decisions.
Thank you. We have a question from Irina. Yeah, you're welcome.
Since Euromaidan times, that was 2013, the beginning of 2014, we have been well aware of the significance of Facebook, the social media where people agreed the places for gathering, for protests. What is this social media for Georgians who every day go to the streets to protest? What do they use, social media or some other communication channels?
I think it's Facebook, but also TV, anything, Twitter, TikTok. I'm not sure. Everything. Like in some countries, as you've mentioned, especially, for example, in Moldova, it was during Voronin's time, I remember it was only Twitter where it was possible, to communicate and set the places to meet. Fortunately, in Georgia, we don't have yet such restrictions, and there are several TV channels that can announce the meeting places for the people who want to hear it. So in this regard, we are, we have a wide range of channels to communicate with one another. It's not a single channel, thank God. And this is for what the people were standing these 3 days in the street to defend.
Thanks. We have one last question from my colleague, the very last one.
Доброго дня.
Good afternoon. My name is Anatoly Kosin. I'm from Media Center, Ukraine, Odessa. I have perhaps the question to Bakur. You've mentioned that around 10% of Georgians tolerate Russians. But perhaps I've met a person from that 10%, and that person says that co-authors of this Russian law are great Georgian patriots who in the 1990s fight against Russia, that they hate Russia. Is this true? Thank you.
I'm not sure if they fought, physically somewhere. I believe Sobar was one of them, was somehow involved in the conflict where Russia is involved for the territorial integrity of the country. But I'm not sure, why would they be so special and different from the people of their age? So I don't know. I'm not sure they like Russia that much themselves. I believe they are opportunists who received, the call from the government that this is the thing to do, and they just, answered the call. Because I think the strategy of the current government is to make sure they stay in power. And if it is through Russians, they're happy with it. If it is through Europeans, they will be happy with that. They don't care, and that is their strategy, actually. They do not really mind, I think, of Georgia becoming a candidate country as long as, they don't ask them to make democratic reforms. As long as, they do not say that make political field more competitive or create a, independent justice system or do anything that would endanger even potentially their grip on power. That's a given. I don't know what goes beyond that. Maybe they are somehow, indebted to Russians, but that could be only a stipulation. But there are signs, obviously, from some of the steps that they have taken, that this could also be true.
Thanks. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for your time, and we hope to see you again, and hope that Georgian people will find a way for prosper and happy future. We wish you all the best.
Thank you.
All the best to you. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава. Thank you for watching us, for joining us. That was a briefing about Georgian protests and its causes and its consequences. Follow our announcements. It's gonna be interesting next week.